Hi everyone, welcome to my room. It is Ren here, and as you can see, my room has changed because I'm back to Ireland. So a little bit more color in the background, but unfortunately I forgot the camel, so I'll have to pick him up when I go home at Christmas time. Now, before I start this video, which will be focused on really understanding the SE function in the INFJ as distinguished from like the NE function, okay? So first of all, just to remind you that I have a book out. You're probably familiar with this by now. The Ecstatic Soul, available for less than $10 ebook and paperback format. All the links available in the description box if you want to have access to the most in-depth investigation of the INFJ ever done. The INFJ from the inside. Look at this beautiful book. Okay, so now that this has been clarified, let me return to this question. I'm seeing in the comments a lot of comments that indicate to me that the SE function in general is not completely understood. And this doesn't surprise me because, you know, it's the SE function is one of the most misunderstood functions, I think, in the whole of Jungian psychology, basically. And the conundrum is the following, all right? We want, on the one hand, to say, well, INFJs and INTJs have inferior SE. So in some way, they must have challenges when it comes to SE, right? But at the same time, we are tempted to think that SE is just about using our senses, our bodily senses, the sense of sight, the sense of hearing, the sense of taste, the sense of touch, and the sense of smell. My sense of smell is not great. It has never been. But in any case, so we're in a conundrum because on the one hand, it seems obvious that everybody, regardless of type, uses their senses. They have to use their senses to survive. Like, the use of your senses is literally how you survive, how you operate in the world. Regardless of whether you think or you act or whatever you do, you're always using your senses. So, of course, there's going to be people who are going to say that INFJs are not really SE inferior, or at least have conscious SE, whereas I would define SE inferior as having SE in a rather unconscious position, because they're saying, well, surely we're conscious of the fact we're moving about in the world, that we are using our senses. Of course, that's true. So if this is our definition of SE, then we have to acknowledge that the SE of the INFJ is just as conscious of the SE of the ESFP, but it's also just as conscious as the SE of the ENFP, even though that function is supposed to be very unconscious in the case of an ENFP. So how do we resolve this paradox? The only way in which we can resolve this paradox is by coming to grips with the fact that SE has nothing to do with the senses. And I know that this is a difficult and counterintuitive proposition, and I will explain it in a second, but if you do not understand this, if you do not appreciate that SE is very much different from the senses, you'll never be able to understand why SE can be undifferentiated and unconscious for some people and highly differentiated and highly conscious for other people. So basically, SE, as you know, is a cognitive function. It's one of the 8 cognitive functions. Now, it's called cognitive. So you have to understand, if something is cognitive, it cannot at the same time be a matter of the senses. Like, my sense of smell is not cognitive. My sense of touch is not cognitive. My sense of hearing is not cognitive. What those senses do is that they receive a physical input from the outside world. What SE does, and what NE does in a different way, is to interpret those inputs and turn them into the facts of perception, things that we can understand on the basis of what we've received. What we receive, what the senses receive, is purely physical. It's an input that is not a perception. The perception of something is different from the thing itself. So when I have a sound, a sound, or when I see something, it's just like combinations of physical objects in the outside world just happening in front of me, and for sound it's similar. But this is not what I perceive. I perceive a particular sound that reminds me of something, or I perceive a sentence that I understand as meaning something. When I see a landscape, I see it as a landscape. I say, oh, maybe there's a harbor with like pleasure boats just moving about, and there's boatmen repairing boats. I'm not talking about, oh, I see like bodies moving that have stuff that covers their bodies, and they're just moving their arms about to manage some kind of big pointy object that somehow rides on the sea. I mean, this would be a purely physical description. It's obviously not what we're doing when we're using our perception. We're always translating the physical input into a fact that we can understand as part of our language. That is what SE does, and that is also what NE does. So the difference between NE and SE is not that SE is about using your senses and NE is about using your like intuition as something that transcends the senses, because that doesn't make sense, because an ENFP has to use their bodily senses just as much as an ESFP does. So it's obviously not what SE captures. What SE captures is how this physical input is interpreted. It interprets the physical input differently from NE. And in my book, just to remind you that the Ecstatic Soul is out, I have a section in chapter 4, The Body Recovered, where I discuss these distinctions. So you can access the detail of those distinctions in this book, but I'm also working on a project that consists in a new paradigm in typology that will take probably a couple of years to finish. I explain what the specific differences are between SE and NE. Essentially, the function of SE is to create a mental construct, the representation of the perception, that is a copy in the mind of the combination of objects that is inputted by the bodily senses. So, say like I have this book here and I have these vitamins here, and there's me and you see me. So if you just consider that to be like a random collection of objects, doesn't have any meaning. SE is going to produce a fact in your brain that represents this book as a book, that as vitamins, Ren as Ren, and combine them in such a way that the relationship between Ren and the book and the vitamins reflects the structure of the actual relationships between the objects, Ren, the book, and the vitamins in physical reality. And so an SE perception is true insofar as it provides a correct photographic copy-like representation of this physical reality. That's what SE does. And that's what INFJs do unconsciously. They're not aware that they're doing that. And that's very different from NE, although NE deserves its own video at a later point, because what NE does is actually not exactly what I just said. NE, of course, is a gathering function. It gathers the external reality into facts. So it could be presented with the exact same physical combination of objects here, but it's actually not going to produce a mental representation with the same contents. Its truth will not depend on whether it is a photographic copy-like representation of the physical reality. There will be a metaphorical element to NE. There will be something like the archaic contents of the unconscious will be summoned in some sense, and that's always the case with intuition, in such a way that this particular object situation will evoke to NE something in addition to the pure copy-like photographic reality of the object situation. There will be something that comes on top of it. It will recognize maybe something like this as a phallic symbol or something like that. Or it will see in the book something, it will create connections that go beyond the mere photographic copy of the situation. And in fact, it makes sense that it's connected to SI, because SI is then a sensory function that will serve to fix all that wide variety of different meanings into a solid representation that can then be used by the functions of judgments. When you are an SE user, you produce a photographic copy. It cannot be used by the functions of judgment because it first has to be processed into something more dynamic, and that can only be done by intuition. And then what differentiates INFJs from other types that use SE is how conscious they are that they're doing this. But keep this in mind, because this is fundamental. SE is not equivalent to the senses. SE is equivalent to a functional interpretation of what the senses tell us. And it does that literally, whereas NE does that metaphorically. Give me a like. Hope you enjoyed the video. Consider subscribing. See you guys.